The silence was the only thing I could hear, a roar that deafened me to the sound of my new parents' laughter. It was a silence born in the space between a cruel joke and a shattered reality, and it belonged to the one person in the room who was supposed to be my guardian angel. My adoptive parents, Mark and Susan, had just made a joke about my past, their voices laced with the casual cruelty of the privileged. But it wasn't their words that turned my blood to ice. It was the social worker, Ms. Carroll. She had frozen, her hand hovering over a glass of water, her face a porcelain mask of pure, primal terror. In that single horrifying moment, the perfect family, the beautiful house, the promise of a forever home, it all dissolved into a lie, and I knew the truth I was about to uncover was far more terrifying than any ghost I had left behind in the foster care system. Before I continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, and leave your like. Helps a lot. Before Mark and Susan, my life was a collection of fragments held together by the worn-out zipper of a duffel bag. For 16 years the word home was a temporary address, a room I never fully unpacked in, a family I never truly belonged to. My name is Aaliyah, and I was a ghost in the foster care system, a world of perpetually exhausted case managers and houses that smelled of someone else's life. I learned early on to be invisible, to take up as little emotional and physical space as possible. If you don't make an impression, it doesn't hurt anyone when you inevitably have to leave. My past was a story with the first chapter ripped out. A mother I couldn't remember, a father who was just a blank line on a government form. I was a puzzle with missing pieces, and I had long given up on ever feeling whole. Each new placement was a performance. I was the star of a one-woman show titled, The Perfect Foster Kid. I smiled on cue, was impeccably polite, achieved top grades, and did chores without ever being asked. I became an expert at being the kind of quiet, easy, grateful child someone might want to keep. But the forever part never materialized. The reasons were always different, yet painfully the same. A family's financial situation changed, a new biological baby was on the way, or the simple, brutal truth that I just wasn't their child. The rejection became a familiar, dull ache in my chest, a constant companion I had learned to live with. Then came Mark and Susan James. On paper they were a fairy tale. They lived in a sprawling, beautiful house in a wealthy suburb, a universe away from the cramped city apartments and worn-down duplexes I was accustomed to. He was a successful lawyer. She was a celebrated architect. During our first meeting, they told Ms. Carroll they couldn't have biological children, their voices filled with a polished, gentle sadness that felt both sincere and rehearsed. They had so much love to give, they insisted, and they had chosen me. The first few months were a dizzying dream. Susan took me on shopping sprees for clothes that cost more than a foster family's entire monthly stipend. She filled my spacious new room with classic novels and expensive art supplies, her hands always fluttering around me, arranging my new life as if she were decorating a room for a magazine shoot. Her lavender perfume was a constant, soft cloud that was supposed to smell like safety, but always felt slightly synthetic. Mark engaged me in long discussions about politics and history at the dinner table, calling me his brilliant girl whenever I offered a thoughtful opinion. He praised my intelligence in a way that seemed to say, "Look what we found." I wanted to believe in it with every fiber of my being. I wanted it so desperately that I packed away the cynical, guarded girl who had survived the system. I tried on a new identity. Aaliyah James, beloved daughter. For the first time I felt like I could take a full, deep breath without waiting for the other shoe to drop. I started thinking in terms of we. We were going to visit Europe this summer. We would start looking at Ivy League colleges next year. My future, once a terrifying void, was now a blueprint designed by my perfect new parents. Ms. Carroll, my social worker for the past 5 years, a tough but fair woman who I believed had seen it all, seemed just as swept up in the fantasy. She rarely smiled, but during her visits to the Jameses' pristine home, her stern features would soften. "They're good people, Aaliyah," she had told me a month before, her voice low and certain. "This is it. This is your home." The adoption hearing was a blur of happy tears, a judge's benevolent smile, and the words, "Congratulations, Aaliyah James." The name felt both alien and exquisite on my tongue. That night, to celebrate, Mark and Susan threw an intimate dinner party. Just the three of us and Ms. Carroll, who was making one final official visit before closing my case forever. Susan prepared an elaborate meal served on fancy china I was almost too scared to breathe on. Mark opened a bottle of expensive champagne, pouring a tiny symbolic drop into a crystal flute for me. "To our family," he toasted, his eyes shining with what looked like genuine emotion. "To our Aaliyah." Everything was flawless. A little too flawless. That cold, familiar knot of anxiety, a phantom limb from my old life, began to tighten in my stomach. It was the feeling I always got right before the ground fell out from under me. I pushed it down, telling myself, "This time is different. This time you are home." After dinner, as we sat with coffee, Susan pulled out a worn cardboard box. "We should make a proper memory box for you," she announced brightly, "to bridge the old with the new." And that's when she pulled it out. It was a faded, dog-eared photograph from one of my first foster homes. In it, a tiny version of me, no older than 3, stood in a messy, dimly lit apartment. I was wearing a tattered dress that was several sizes too big. My hair was a tangled mess, and a smudge of dirt marked my cheek. In my small hands, I clutched a broken doll with blank, staring eyes. Susan held the picture between her perfectly manicured fingers, her face a mask of performative pity. She turned to Mark, a subtle smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, Mark, look at this," she said, her voice dripping with a saccharine amusement. "Just look at her little ghetto roots. To think she came from this to this." She waved a dismissive hand around the opulent dining room, at the crystal and silver, as if she were presenting a miracle she had single-handedly performed. Mark chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "We certainly saved you from a different kind of life, didn't we, Aaliyah?" he added, winking at me as if I were in on their cruel joke. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ghetto roots. The phrase struck me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the blatant cruelty. It was the way they looked at that picture of a lost, lonely little girl and saw only something dirty, something unfortunate that needed to be erased and replaced by their polished, superior version of me. The casualness of it was what broke my heart. This wasn't a clumsy mistake. This was a glimpse into how they truly saw me. I was not their daughter. I was their project. Their charity case, a living testament to their own generosity. The familiar hollowness I had tried so hard to banish yawned open in my chest. The grand dining room suddenly felt cold and alien. The scent of lavender was no longer comforting. It was cloying and suffocating, a chemical perfume trying to mask something rotten underneath. My throat tightened, and I stared down at my dessert plate, willing myself to become that ghost I knew so well how to be. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to laugh along, to perform gratitude for being saved. But I couldn't. All I could feel was the sting of their derision. In the ringing silence where my appreciative laughter was supposed to be, I risked a glance at the only other person at the table. And that's when I saw her. Miss Carroll was frozen. I don't mean she was simply quiet or still. She had utterly and completely stopped moving. Her hand, which had been reaching for her water glass, was suspended in mid-air. The polite professional smile she had worn all evening had vanished, her mouth hanging slightly agape. Her eyes were wide, fixed on Mark and Susan, but it was as if she were looking straight through them at some unspeakable horror only she could see. It was a look of pure, gut-wrenching shock, the kind of expression you'd expect if they had just confessed to a gruesome murder, not made a tasteless joke. Her face, normally a controlled and neutral mask, was as white as a sheet. The moment stretched into an eternity. Susan's self-satisfied smile faltered, replaced by confusion. Mark's chuckle died in his throat. They both turned to look at Ms. Carroll. "Carroll, are you all right?" Susan asked, her voice losing its smug edge and gaining a flicker of concern. Ms. Carroll didn't respond. She just stared, her body rigid, her breath seemingly trapped in her lungs. The silence was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It was a silent scream that told me the joke was not just a joke. It was something more. Something dangerous. Finally, with a convulsive shudder, Ms. Carroll blinked. Her suspended hand dropped to the table with a thud that made all of us jump. She swallowed hard, struggling to pull her professional mask back into place, but it was a poor fit. Her eyes were still haunted. I'm sorry, she stammered, her voice a strained, barely audible whisper. I think I need some air. She pushed her chair back from the table so abruptly it nearly fell over and practically fled from the room. Mark and Susan exchanged a bewildered look, their mean-spirited joke already forgotten in the wake of her bizarre reaction. Well, that was bizarre, Mark muttered, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. But I wasn't listening. My mind was racing, replaying the scene over and over. The joke, the condescending laughter, and the freeze. This wasn't just a social worker reacting to her clients being unkind. I'd seen Ms. Carroll handle foster parents who were genuinely awful without even blinking. This was different. This was visceral. This was personal. Her terror was a signpost, and it pointed directly toward a secret I suddenly knew I had to uncover. A secret that wasn't just about my past, but about hers, and about the beautiful, perfect, lying couple who called themselves my parents. If you're still here with me, don't forget to subscribe, activate notifications, leave your like, and share this video with someone. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in denial. Mark and Susan behaved as if that disastrous dinner had never happened. They smothered me with an overly cheerful, frantic energy, buying me expensive gifts and planning extravagant trips. It was a desperate performance of a happy family, but the script was weak and the actors were unconvincing. There was no genuine warmth, only a brittle tension simmering just beneath the surface. The house, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a beautifully decorated prison. The scent of lavender started to remind me of a funeral home, a sweet smell meant to cover the decay. I played my part, the grateful daughter, but it was a role I no longer believed in. The ghost was back. I was observing, listening, every part of my being consumed by a single burning question. Why did Ms. Carroll freeze? I tried calling her office, desperate for a clue. Aaliyah, she answered, her voice too bright, too forced. Is everything all right? I'm fine, I said, keeping my own voice level. I was just calling about that night. At the dinner. You seemed upset. There was a weighted pause on the other end of the line. Oh, that, she said, the words rushing out. I'm so sorry, I wasn't feeling well at all. I think I was coming down with a nasty bug. Don't you worry about it. It was a lie, and a poorly constructed one at that. I could hear the tremor in her voice. You looked scared, I pressed, unwilling to let it go. Aaliyah, she said, and her tone changed, becoming firm and cold, like a steel door slamming shut. Susan and Mark are wonderful people. You have a beautiful home and an incredible future ahead of you. My advice is to focus on that, not on insignificant moments from the past. My file on you is officially closed. I wish you the best. The line went dead, leaving me with the dial tone buzzing in my ear. Her dismissal was all the proof I needed. She was hiding something and she was terrified of me finding it. My quiet quest for answers became an obsession, a secret investigation into my own life story. I started in Susan's pristine home office. She was obsessively organized, everything filed and labeled. It was in the back of a heavy metal filing cabinet, inside a folder simply labeled Aaliyah, that I found my adoption file. I waited until they were both out for the evening, then I spread the documents across the floor of my room, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. I spent hours poring over the bureaucratic jargon, the endless forms and assessments. But there was nothing about my birth parents. My mother was listed as Jane Doe. My father was a blank space. My place of birth was noted only as St. Jude's Regional Hospital. It was a series of dead ends, a past deliberately obscured. Defeated, I started paying closer attention to the house itself, listening for secrets in the silences. I noticed the way Susan would flinch and change the subject if I asked a simple question about when they had first decided to adopt. The strange, fleeting looks of guilt and sadness that would cross Mark's face when he thought I wasn't looking. The breakthrough came from the attic. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Susan, in a burst of manufactured domesticity, asked me to fetch a box of old holiday decorations. The attic was a graveyard of the family's forgotten past, everything shrouded in white, dusty sheets like rows of specters. In a dark, cobweb-filled corner, behind a stack of old magazines, I found it, a heavy, leather-bound photo album. It was old and worn, completely different from the sleek, modern albums Susan kept in the living room. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first few pages showed a younger Mark and Susan, radiant on their honeymoon. Then the pictures changed. They were in a hospital, holding a baby. A tiny little girl with a tuft of blonde hair and big blue eyes. In every single photograph, Susan wore a smile of such radiant, genuine joy that it took my breath away. It was a smile I had never once seen directed at me. They looked deliriously, completely happy. The girl's name, written in delicate cursive beneath the photos, was Lily. There were pictures of Lily's first steps, her first birthday party with a huge pink cake, a trip to the beach where she played in the sand. She grew from a baby into a bright-eyed toddler. And then, abruptly, halfway through the album, the pictures stopped. The rest of the thick, creamy pages were starkly, unnervingly empty. The story had been violently cut short. A cold dread crept up my spine. Who was Lily? Why had they never, not once, mentioned her name? Was I her replacement? A stand-in for the ghost who haunted this house. Their cruel joke about my ghetto roots echoed in my mind, but now it sounded different, more sinister. They weren't just mocking my past in the system. They were mocking a past that wasn't blonde and blue-eyed like Lily's. They were reinforcing the chasm between their perfect, lost daughter and me, the outsider. But it still didn't explain Ms. Carroll's reaction. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I felt something tucked into a small envelope in the back of the album. It was a tiny, faded pink hospital bracelet. On it, two names were printed in faint block letters. The mother, Susan James. The baby, Lily James. And then, in even tinier print, was the name of the hospital, St. Jude's Regional. And below that, the attending nurse. C. Reynolds. C. Reynolds. Curl. Miss Carroll's last name was Reynolds. My blood ran cold, and the air left my lungs in a rush. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a conspiracy. Miss Carroll wasn't just my social worker. She was there when Lily was born. She knew them from the very beginning. Her terrified face at the dinner table finally made a horrifying kind of sense. Her terror wasn't about a mean joke. It was about a lie. A lie she had been a part of for 16 years. A lie so monumental that a single careless comment about my real roots had threatened to detonate everything. I had the album. I had the bracelet. I had the name. Now I just needed the truth, and I was going to get it. The next day I skipped school. With the heavy photo album in my backpack and the tiny plastic bracelet clutched in my pocket, I took the bus to Ms. Carroll's office downtown. The scared foster kid was gone. In her place was a daughter who had been denied her own story, and I was here to claim it. I walked into the sterile government building and told the receptionist I had an urgent appointment with Carol Reynolds. Miss Carroll met me in the hallway, her face pale and drawn. "Aaliyah, what are you doing here? You should be in school." "I think you know," I said, my voice unnervingly steady. "We need to talk. In your office. Now." She didn't argue. She led me into her cluttered, chaotic office and shut the door behind us. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't say a word. I pulled the leather album from my bag, opened it to a picture of baby Lily, and placed it squarely in the middle of her desk. A small, strangled gasp escaped her lips. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her eyes wide with dread. "In the attic," I stated flatly. Then I took the tiny plastic bracelet from my pocket and placed it on top of Lily's smiling face. "I also found this. St. Jude's Regional Hospital. Attending nurse, C. Reynolds." She stared at the bracelet as if it were a venomous snake, and every last bit of color drained from her face. She sank into her office chair, all the fight, all the pretense gone. "You weren't just my social worker," I said, my voice low and accusatory. "You were there from the beginning. You knew them. You knew her." I pointed to the picture of Lily. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were swimming with unshed tears. "I was a nurse," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It was my first year, fresh out of school. I was working in the maternity ward at St. Jude's." She took a deep, ragged breath, and the story she had held captive for 16 years began to spill out. Susan and Mark James came in, so excited for their perfect life, their perfect baby. But there was another mother who came in that night. A young girl, a runaway. No name, no family, no one. She was terrified. She gave birth to a healthy baby girl. And then, in the middle of the night, she vanished. Just disappeared, leaving the baby behind. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew, with a sickening certainty, where this was going. "Susan had a very difficult delivery," Miss Carroll continued, her voice breaking. "Her baby, Lily, was born with a severe congenital heart defect. The doctors said she wouldn't live more than a few years. Mark and Susan were completely devastated." She wiped a tear from her cheek with a shaking hand. I was so young, so naive. I felt so incredibly sorry for them. They had everything and it was all being torn away. And then I looked at this other baby, healthy, beautiful, and utterly alone. So I made a terrible, life-altering decision. She looked directly at me, her eyes pleading for an absolution I couldn't give. There was a moment of chaos. Shift change. I switched the baby's ankle bracelets. I took the abandoned baby, the healthy one, to the Jameses. I told them there had been a mistake in the initial tests, that their daughter was perfectly healthy. And I registered their sick baby, the real Lily, as the abandoned Jane Doe infant. The room began to spin. The runaway girl's baby. The one they raised. Was that me? You gave me to them? I choked out, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. She nodded, tears now streaming down her face. "They raised you as their own for 2 years. They adored you. They thought you were their miracle. But the real Lily, their biological daughter, was placed in the foster care system. She passed away in a group home when she was 4 years old." Felt sick. Lily, the ghost in the album. She was the one who had died in the system I had just escaped, all alone. But why did they give me up? I asked, my mind reeling. If they loved me and thought I was their healthy baby. "Because they found out," she said, her voice thick with shame. "When you were 2 years old, a routine blood test for an allergy revealed the impossible. You weren't their biological child. Their world shattered all over again. They felt betrayed by God, by the hospital, by you. They couldn't look at you anymore without seeing the lie, without being reminded of their real, sick daughter who was lost somewhere out there. So they surrendered you to the state. They made up a story about finding an abandoned baby on their doorstep, moved to a new city, and tried to erase the whole chapter. It all slammed into place. The cruelty, distance, a joke, a freeze. So when they adopted me, I began, my voice a whisper. "Carol, you orchestrated it, didn't you? You found me in the system and brought me back to them. I've lived with the guilt every single day," she cried. I thought maybe I could fix it. That I could bring you back to them and it would be a second chance for everyone. A way to atone." The final, most devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place in my mind, and I looked at her with dawning horror. I remembered the file. St. Jude's Regional Hospital. That was my birthplace too. The runaway's baby was from St. Jude's. The James's baby was from St. Jude's. "Carol," I said, my voice barely audible. "The night they surrendered the baby they thought was me. The runaway's baby. What happened to her?" Carol looked confused. "They surrendered you, Aaliyah. They gave you up." "No," I said, the truth hitting me like lightning. "They didn't. You made another mistake, didn't you? In the chaos, you didn't just switch the bracelets. You switched the files. You have it all wrong. And then I said the words that would change everything. When they mocked my ghetto roots, they weren't mocking the past of some runaway's child. They were mocking my journey through the system. The journey you sent me on. A new, more profound horror filled her eyes as she finally understood. Oh my God, she breathed. The initial diagnosis for Lily. It was wrong. The doctors made a mistake. You were healthy all along. The world stopped. I wasn't the runaway's daughter. I wasn't a replacement. I was Lily. I was their daughter. Their biological daughter who was never sick. The baby they gave away was the runaway's. They had abandoned the wrong child. And all these years later they had adopted me, their own flesh and blood, without ever knowing it. The entire labyrinthine lie was built on a foundation of errors. And when my mother held up that photo and mocked the past of the child she thought was a charity case, she was unknowingly mocking the brutal journey of her own lost daughter. Ms. Carroll froze because she was the only one in that room who knew the whole, catastrophic truth. She had just watched a mother unwittingly condemn her own child. I walked out of Ms. Carroll's office in a disoriented daze, the world tilted on its axis. When I finally arrived back at the house, they were waiting for me, standing like statues in the grand entryway. Mark and Susan, my parents. The perfect masks they had worn for so long had been shattered, leaving behind faces wrecked with fear and dawning comprehension. Miss Carroll had called them. Aaliyah. Susan started, taking a hesitant step toward me, her hand outstretched. Is my name Aaliyah? I asked, my voice cold and hollow, echoing in the cavernous hall. Or is it Lily? Susan flinched as if I had struck her. The name, her lost daughter's name, was a physical blow. We know, Mark said, his voice quiet and heavy with a grief that was 16 years old. Carol told us everything. We know that you know. We stood there in the crushing silence of that big, empty-feeling house, strangers bound by a tragedy of errors. Why? Finally asked. The single word held the weight of a lifetime of abandonment and confusion. Even if you didn't know it was me. Why bring a child back into your life just to resent her? Just to mock her? That's when Susan broke. She began to sob, not the gentle practiced tears I had seen before, but ugly wrenching sobs of profound guilt. We weren't mocking you, she choked out, the words tearing from her. We were mocking ourselves. When we found out the baby we had raised and loved wasn't ours, we fell apart. We felt like we had been cursed. We gave her up, and then we spent years trying to forget. Adopting you. We told ourselves it was a way to atone for what we did to that other poor child. A way to punish ourselves. But every time I looked at you, I saw the ghost of the baby who wasn't ours. And the cruelty. The jokes. It was aimed at us. At the horrible, unforgivable mess we had made of everything. It was a confession, not an excuse. It didn't erase a single moment of the pain, but for the first time, I saw them not as calculated monsters, but as broken, grieving people who had stumbled from one catastrophic mistake into another, creating a web of lies that had ensnared us all. That night, I packed the same duffel bag I had arrived with. I couldn't stay in a house so haunted by ghosts. The ghost of the baby they gave away, and the ghost of the daughter they never knew they had. But as I walked to the front door, a car was waiting in the driveway. It was Ms. Carroll. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her expression was different. It was determined. You can't go back into the system, Aaliyah, she said, her voice firm. And you can't stay here, not now. I have a sister who lives a few towns over. She has a spare room. You can stay with her. For as long as you need. It wasn't a solution, but it was an escape. It was a chance to breathe. The months that followed were a painful blur of therapy sessions and legal meetings. My family, the one I had longed for my entire life, was irreparably broken. But in its place, something new and fragile began to grow between me and Ms. Carroll, a complicated bond forged in the ruins of the life she had destroyed, and then, in her own strange way, given back to me. I never went back to live with Mark and Susan. The wounds were too deep, the truths too raw. But we started talking, not as parents and a daughter, but as three survivors of a shared disaster, learning to navigate our new reality. The healing is agonizingly slow. Some days, the anger is a fresh, open wound. I'm 17 now. I live with Ms. Carroll's sister, and I'm finishing high school. And I'm Aaliyah. I chose to keep the name. It's the name of the girl who survived, the one I built myself to be. Lily is a part of my story, a ghost I am learning to live with, a sister I never knew, a life I never had. My long search for a family didn't lead me to a perfect house with perfect parents. It led me back to myself, to the truth of who I am. The perfect family was always an illusion. But the truth, as messy and as painful as it is, has its own kind of power. Uncovering it didn't destroy me. In the end, it set me free. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, leave your like, and share this video with others.